Well, I've just never been more disrespected in my life, you know.
Right here.
Another big headline coming out of, this offseason, and that's Dalvin Cook deciding that he's going to hold out. The report latest was he felt disrespected by Minnesota's offer. This is out of usatoday.com.
Oh, sounds like someone familiar I know over here on this show.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know.
Is Big Travie? Are you all of a sudden Dalvin Cook's agent, or you guys have the same agent?
We share
the same agent. Got it. All right, makes sense now.
But here's the thing.
I thought I'd heard this.
Well, I've just never been more disrespected in my life, you know, and I just feel like I'm going to have to hold out to prove my worth here to the Fantasy Whisperers. I'm just saying. But no, all kidding aside here, Dalvin Cook is planning to hold out, and there is a contract dispute there. So, Johnny, it's really got me wondering now. You talked about the ADP at the top of the show. Is Dalvin Cook worth the risk in 2020?
So his current ADP right now is 105. Like I said, in most mock drafts that we have gone, like Dalvin is like the third pick in general. And if he comes into training camp and signs, I expect him to be that third pick, the 103. Even with that, he had 250 carries last year. He had 53 receptions for 519 yards. You look at Gary Kubiak coming in, you could say that with the offensive scheme that those numbers could go up. Gary Kubiak runs a nice zone scheme, which Dalvin Cook is good in. The receptions could go up for him. So, you could be seeing he had over 1,100 rushing yards, which ranked 9th in the league. So all of that is good. All those are good signs. And I'm not doubting that. He was number 4 in evaded tackles with 86. Like, this guy is a talented running back. But what I will say is a couple of things. I talk about the receptions. He had 8 drops last year. That was number 2 in the league for running backs. He's got to get that up. And he did have 11 breakaway runs, which was good for 8th in the league. I expect that to regress. I don't think he'll get as many breakaway runs. But here's why I am off of the boat, and I do think that Dalvin Cook is too big of a risk in 2020. You look at all of the previous running backs who have held out. Regardless or irregardless, I'm not sure which one to use here, but regardless of whether they signed or not, or held out for a significant amount of time, in almost every single case that I looked up, except for, I looked at 15 cases, and of those 15 cases, only 3 of them did the
player. It was like Emmitt Smith, Eric Dickerson, and a couple like phenom running backs that had monster years that year.
Yep, and other than those guys,
in Dickerson's case, he held out the first time with the Rams, balled out. He held out the second time with the Colts, was not like he was not the same afterwards.
And if you look at recent stuff, Zeke, Gordon, and David Johnson. The David Johnson one is kind of hard because he was injured that year after he really popped off, and then he held out after being injured. So I couldn't really get a gauge on like the drop off there. But you look at Melvin Gordon, who did it last year. 2 years ago, right before the holdout, he was averaging 22.6 points per game. Last year when he came back after the holdout, he was only averaging 15.1 points per game. So a pretty significant drop off there of like 7 points. Zeke, he did come back before the start of the season, but he held out most of training camp. His drop off from 2018, he scored 21.8 fantasy points per game, and then in 2019, he only scored 19.5 fantasy points per game. So a drop off of about 2 fantasy points, which might not seem significant, but ask Travis, ask me, ask Chelsea. There's been several games that we have lost under 2 points per game. So that's pretty significant for a guy who, is you're drafting with your very first pick. I want that to be solid. I don't want to be there. I want as little risk as possible with that pick. And for me, Dalvin Cook is just too expensive, and I see a regression. So
at the risk of having recency bias, you have to look at, these holdouts that have happened. And I think last year's with Melvin Gordon is the best one to look at. I think you're talking about guys that are similar in talent. Maybe Dalvin Cook has slightly more talent. Maybe he does. But maybe the Chargers offense was a little bit more explosive if you're thinking about it. And so in that case, I think that it evens out. And if you're saying that he is this year's Melvin Gordon, then that ADP has to come down, because right now it's at the 105 spot. And right there, yes, Dalvin Cook is not worth the risk at 105. He starts getting to the back of the first, the beginning to middle of the second. I'm kind of okay if we have some signs that this could happen, because you're able to get another stud,
right,
and you don't have to absorb so much risk right away if your other stud hits. So yes, Dalvin Cook is a little bit too risky this year.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Whisperers podcast. You can hear more from John and Travis on Google Play, SoundCloud, and iTunes. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at TF Whisperers.